Do you remember the first one you ever saw? That deep V-bow cutting through a Florida inlet, that low white hull sitting in the marina like it owned the water underneath it. The sound of twin engines firing at a dock in 1963. That low, authoritative growl that told you before the boat even moved that this was something different from everything else tied up around it. For an entire generation of American men, the Bertram 31 was the boat you worked your whole career toward. The one that meant you had earned something real, that the ocean was yours on a Saturday morning if you had the nerve to go out and take it. More than 1,800 were built in a rented warehouse in Miami by men who fished the same waters they worked beside. It was the most imitated offshore fishing boat on Earth. The deep V hull it proved to the world became the foundational design of every serious sport fishing boat built anywhere since 1961. Time magazine called the man who built it the Enzo Ferrari of offshore boats. In every serious fishing port from the Bahamas to the Mediterranean, a Bertram 31 had arrived before you did. But today, the factory in Hialeah is gone. The name belongs to an Italian conglomerate. The Europeans who spent 30 years studying what American boat builders had created now dominate the global market that American hands built from nothing. And here is what nobody tells you. America did not lose the offshore boat market to better boats. America did not lose it to cheaper labor or smarter engineering or a foreign government that backed its builders better. America lost it because the people who owned the Bertram 31 did not understand what they had. And then a congressman from Chicago who had never spent a morning offshore finished the job with a single piece of legislation passed the day before an election, without one hearing on what it would do to the men building boats for a living. Understand what happened to the Bertram 31 and you understand what happened to the entire American boat industry. The same decisions, the same distance, the same indifference from the same kind of people. This is not the story of how the market destroyed the American boat industry. This is the story of how America destroyed it itself. In 1958, a 36-year-old Miami yacht broker named Richard Bertram sailed to Newport, Rhode Island to compete in the America's Cup trials. He was already a serious offshore racer, a man who understood open water through his hands without needing to explain it. He had won the Miami-Nassau offshore race twice. He knew what rough water did to a boat, and he knew which boats handled it and which ones didn't. What stopped him in Newport had nothing to do with the 12-meter yachts he had come to race. Tied to a dock between sessions, bobbing in the Atlantic chop with complete indifference to the conditions around it, was a 23-foot utility tender that moved through the water differently from anything Bertram had ever seen. Not over it, not punching through with brute force. But it moved with the water, reading the surface, responding to it, staying controlled at a speed that should have had a boat that size pounding violently. The boat belonged to C. Raymond Hunt, a New England naval architect. The hull Hunt had drawn carried its deep V shape all the way back to the transom. Every other powerboat hull of the era compromised that V shape amidships to gain flat water speed. Hunt hadn't. The result was a boat that was slower than its rivals on a calm day and superior to every one of them the moment conditions deteriorated. He had built a hull for the ocean as it actually was, not as it appeared in the brochure. Bertram introduced himself on the dock. He commissioned a set of plans. He went back to Miami and built a 30-foot wooden version of Hunt's design on the Miami River. He named it Moppy, after his wife Pauline's childhood nickname. He had no idea what he had just started. 4 days of storm weather churned the Bahamas before the 1960 Miami-Nassau race. By race morning, winds were blowing 15 to 25 knots and the water between Florida and Nassau was what offshore racers call serious. The kind of conditions that sorted out which boats were built for the ocean and which were built for the showroom. Dick Bertram and his partner Sam Griffith entered Moppy and led from the start. They crossed the finish line 8 hours after departure, more than 2 hours ahead of every other boat. The Miami Herald put it on the front page. Sports Illustrated sent a writer. By the time Bertram stepped off the dock that afternoon, men he had never met were approaching him with checkbooks already open. He said later, "There were so damn many yachtsmen waving checkbooks at me that I had to go into business." He rented a warehouse in Hialeah, a working waterfront suburb north of Miami, and used the original Moppy as a mold for a fiberglass production version. The Bertram 31 made its world premiere at the 1961 New York National Boat Show. It sold before the show closed. The following year, a fiberglass Bertram 31 called Glass Moppy won the Miami-Nassau race again. The offshore world had its answer. A rented warehouse in Hialeah with the smell of fiberglass resin and marine teak. Men who had fished these waters all their lives, building a boat they believed in. The morning shift arriving with coffee thermoses and hands that knew the difference between a hull laid right and a hull laid fast. The kind of operation that thinks of itself as a craft, because that is exactly what it is. Stand on any serious dock on the Florida coast in 1967 and you would find one. Sometimes two. Walk the marinas in the Bahamas, along the Yucatan, down the Baja coast. Same answer. In every port where serious offshore fishing happened, from the Gulf Stream to the Mediterranean, the Bertram 31 had arrived before you did. By the late 1960s, it was not simply the best offshore fishing boat in the world. It had become the definition of the category. Every competitor that came after it either built on the deep V principles it had proven or found themselves explaining why they hadn't. Every naval architect working in offshore powerboating studied what Ray Hunt had done and what Dick Bertram had proved in open water. The argument had been won so completely that the entire industry accepted the verdict and built around it. The cockpit was enormous for a 31-foot boat. The ride quality in rough water was so far ahead of its class that journalists ran out of superlatives and started quoting the fishermen instead. The fiberglass construction was laid so thick and true that hulls built in the mid-1960s are still fishing today. You do not build a boat that lasts 60 years by cutting corners. The men in Hialeah did not cut corners. 1,860 hulls across 22 years of production. Dealers from Florida to the entire eastern seaboard. An export market stretching from Europe to Central America. From a rented warehouse in a Miami suburb, the Bertram 31 had built a market, dominated it, and then become the standard by which everything else in that market was measured. Within 10 years of the first hull leaving Hialeah, it would be the most copied offshore fishing design in the world. Within 4, the man who built it would step away from the company he had started, and what followed, 3 decisions taken by people who had never fished offshore in their lives, would not just end the Bertram 31. It would tear open the American boat industry and leave it bleeding on the dock while the Europeans walked in and picked up everything that was left. If you are finding this story as remarkable as I am, hit subscribe. There is a lot more American industrial history on this channel that I think you will want to see. The first decision came in 1964. Dick Bertram, the man who had raced Moppy through 6-foot Bahamian waves with a broken compass and built a global industry on a design he believed in before anyone else did, stepped away from the company that carried his name. He was 46 years old. The Bertram 31 was 3 years into production. The orders were overwhelming the warehouse. The brand was already becoming a legend, and the man who created it was no longer running it. 4 years later, in 1968, the Whitaker Corporation, a California-based defense and industrial conglomerate manufacturing aerospace components, electronic systems, and industrial hardware, acquired Bertram Yacht. Nobody in Whitaker's California offices had spent a morning offshore. Nobody had stood in the Hialeah warehouse and watched a hull come out of the mold and understood what that moment meant. The Bertram 31 was, to the people now responsible for it, a product line inside an industrial portfolio. It sat alongside aerospace contracts and electronic components in a quarterly report that nobody in Hialeah ever saw. The craftsmen kept building. The orders kept coming. For several years, the distance between the California boardroom and the Hialeah workshop didn't show in the finished boats. But the decisions about investment, about production priorities, about what the Bertram line would become, those were being made by men who measured boats in return on capital, not in the way a deep V hull behaves in a 6-foot sea. It is a different kind of measurement. It produces different answers. Dick Bertram remained connected to the sport. He went on to set a world speed record for diesel-powered vessels. But the company that carried his name was no longer his to direct, and the men who built the boats he had designed had new employers with different priorities. The second decision unfolded slowly, because Whitaker would not be the last corporate owner to make it. The Bertram name passed through multiple hands over the next 2 decades. Each new owner arrived with the same logic: a valuable brand, strong customer loyalty, an opportunity to extract more from the asset than the previous owner had managed. Each transfer carried another layer of distance between the boat and the people who understood what it was. New models were added to chase price points. Production decisions were made against timelines determined by people who had never stood on a shop floor. The material standards the original Hialeah craftsmen had held as a point of professional pride began to drift in the direction that cutting costs always pushes them. What most people don't realize is that the accumulated knowledge in a craft operation is not written down anywhere. It lives in the hands and eyes of the men on the floor. It gets passed on by standing beside someone and watching how they work and understanding why. When the decisions about how a boat is built start coming from people who have never built one, that knowledge doesn't transfer to the new management. It disappears, quietly, irreversibly. By the time regular production of the Bertram 31 ended in 1983, the hulls from the 1960s were still fishing, still winning tournaments, still proving the original case. The reputation held because the original boats were indestructible. But the company producing new hulls under that name was not the same enterprise that had opened in a Hialeah warehouse on the strength of a race won with a broken compass. By the late 1980s, recession and accumulated ownership changes had stripped the Hialeah workforce from over 1,200 at its peak to, at one point, barely 30 people. 30 people. In the factory that had once built the finest offshore fishing boat on Earth. What was happening to Bertram was not an isolated story. It was the same story playing out across the entire American boat industry simultaneously. Corporate consolidation stripping craft operations of the people who understood them. Decisions made by balance sheets instead of boat builders. An industry that had dominated the world for 30 years being quietly hollowed out from the inside. The Bertram 31 was not the cause of that. It was the clearest possible proof of it. The third decision did not come from a boardroom. It came from Washington, D.C., from men who did not represent a single boat-building district between them and who did not hold one hearing on what their decision would do to the people who built boats for a living. On November 5, 1990, Congress passed a 10% luxury tax on any new boat purchased for more than $100,000. The bill's primary architect, Congressman Dan Rostenkowski of Chicago, chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, the most powerful man in tax policy in Washington, rushed it through without a single hearing, the day before a congressional election. He announced it as simple fairness. The wealthy would pay more. The logic was clean. It was completely wrong. What Rostenkowski did not understand, because he represented Chicago, not Hialeah, not any working waterfront community, was that wealthy Americans did not have to buy new boats. A buyer who decided a new boat cost too much simply bought a used one instead, or kept what he had. The tax did not reach into the pockets of the rich. It reached into the payroll of the craftsmen who built the boats the rich decided not to purchase. Sales of large American-built boats collapsed 80% within months of the tax taking effect in January 1991. The Congressional Joint Economic Committee confirmed that the EU tax destroyed 7,600 boating industry jobs in its first year alone and cost the federal government more in unemployment benefits than it collected in revenue. The National Marine Manufacturers Association estimated that across the full period, over 25,000 boating industry jobs were lost in total. Congress had passed a tax that lost money while destroying an industry. Bertram Yacht filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in 1992. The company that had invented the Deep V hull, that had built the most respected offshore fishing boat in the world, that had given an entire industry its foundational design and proved it in open water every time anyone doubted it, was bankrupt, not because a better boat had replaced it, because a congressman from Chicago had rushed a tax through without a single hearing on what it would do to the men who showed up every morning in a waterfront warehouse and built something the whole world wanted. The luxury tax was repealed in August 1993. By then it was too late. The craftsmen were gone. The factories were hollowed out. The market American manufacturers had dominated for 30 years stood open. The Europeans walked straight through the door. Ferretti from Italy, Princess from England, Sunseeker from Dorset. Builders who had spent years studying what American boat builders had done were now ready to fill the space that American corporate decisions and American legislative carelessness had cleared for them. They never gave it back. In 1998, Ferretti Group of Italy acquired what remained of Bertram Yacht, the brand name, the hull designs. The legacy built in a Hialeah warehouse by men whose hands were stained with fiberglass resin and whose knowledge of offshore water was the kind you can only earn one crossing at a time. New boats continued under the Bertram name, but the thing that had made Hialeah different from every other boat factory in the world, the accumulated knowledge of craftsmen who had built 1,860 hulls by hand and understood every one of them, could not be packaged and transferred in a bankruptcy auction. It went with the men who carried it. In 2022, Bertram established a European production facility in Marina di Carrara, Italy. The brand that Dick Bertram had built in Miami, that had proved itself in Bahamian storms, that had defined what an American offshore fishing boat should be, now builds boats for the European market on Italian soil. Stand on the waterfront in Miami today and look at the water Dick Bertram crossed in November 1960. The Deep V hull is everywhere. Every offshore sport fishing boat built anywhere in the world carries its principles. The argument the Bertram 31 made about what a boat should be is so completely won that the industry no longer debates it. The design is universal. The standard is American. The company is Italian. Close your eyes. Listen for the twin engines of a Bertram 31 clearing the inlet at speed. Smell the fiberglass resin and the marine teak drifting out of the Hialeah warehouse on a Tuesday morning. Hear the shift arriving with coffee thermoses and calloused hands, men who had been building these boats since the year Kennedy was inaugurated, who knew before any magazine told them that what they were making was the finest offshore fishing boat on Earth. Picture Dick Bertram on the dock at Nassau in November 1960, more than 2 hours ahead of every other boat in the race, men waving checkbooks, the whole industry about to change because one man believed in a hull design that everyone else had walked past. Open your eyes. The warehouse in Hialeah is gone. The craftsmen are gone. The company is on another continent. We did not lose the Bertram 31 to a better boat. We did not lose it to foreign competition that outbuilt or outdesigned us. We lost it to a founder who left too soon, a corporation that bought it and treated it like a line item, and a generation of owners who understood the name but not the thing the name stood for. And we lost it to a congressman from Chicago who passed a tax without a single hearing on what it would do to the men who showed up every morning in a waterfront warehouse and built with their hands something the whole world wanted. The Bertram 31 did not destroy the American boat industry alone. But what happened to it? The indifference, the distance, the decisions made by people who never once stood on a rolling deck in open water and understood what they were protecting. That is, exactly how the American boat industry was destroyed. Every American builder suffered some version of those same 3 decisions. The Bertram 31 just happened to be the finest example of what was being thrown away. If this story landed the way I think it did, the story of what happened to American motorcycle manufacturing is waiting for you right now,